breaking or igniting servers. Not as hard as you think. Alex Bazhaniuk y Jesse Michael explicarán y mostrarán cómo vulnerabilidades previamente no divulgadas en imágenes de firmwares UEFI y BMC pueden aprovecharse para que un atacante tome control total de un sistema, persistencia ilimitada y hasta deshabilitar el sistema.
Thank you, everyone, to stay here. I know that we are between you and lunch. That's a pretty tough choice, I understand. I will not promise you that I will finish early, but we will try. Yeah, my name is Alex. Here's Jesse. You may hear us yesterday. Yeah, the microphone doesn't work. Is it better? Okay, sounds better. All right, so my name is Alex. We have Jesse here, and we have a second presentation here in Ekoparty. The first one was yesterday, and there was like some complaints that our English is not that good, so I may switch to Russian because I don't know much Spain, except a couple words I learned yesterday. I don't want to practice that words, but I believe they're pretty convincing, so I know a little bit of that. Anyway, so we'll talk today about breaking and implanting servers. So over our presentation, we'll go to the couple different topics. Some of you may expect that it will be focused only on BMC. It will have couple different topics, including BMC, and we will go over like best practices and what we think attackers think about implantings, different platform, different components, as well as breaking the servers and breaking different equipment. So typical enterprise has a bunch of servers, pretty expensive servers. Some servers may cost like $500,000, and they serve like a critical part of the business for the enterprises. It could be a telecom, it could be a banks, it could be like really critical 1 or 2 servers. And in typical enterprise, there is of course technology to make a sort of maintenance period when there is like one server replaced by another server, and you have maintenance period of that when you make an updates or check the hardware, check your RAID controller or something like that. But typically, like even if you have a backup, you usually use the same hardware for the backup. So because it's much more easy if you have like exactly the same hardware, you have less chances to have any stability issue in the software. So you basically get the one hardware, make an exactly same copy, and you just redirect traffic, and you have same hardware. So and there is a consequences to having the same hardware cross the backup and your production, because if there is any infection could compromise one of the server over hardware firmware, that could make the similar to the backup and make a system unbootable for some time. And it may damage that critical business, because if you assume like, okay, I have a really critical server, if it will go down and then I will recover my backup, and then the backup can go down because it was similar system. You added in similar like network, it may have similar BMC vulnerability, exploit it similarly, and compromise it like a spy controller and make system unbreakable. So that's the scope of that's the problem which we try to understand. What the ways attacker may think about break the system, make the system unbootable, or what the ways attacker may use to compromise the system, to implant the system. So let's talk a little bit more. We'll jump in details, but before we'll go there, there is a couple of in the wild attack was demonstrated that breaking the infrastructure, breaking the system is kind of part of the nation state type of actors. So there was a couple of examples which is wiping MBR in the system to make system unbootable. And if you're familiar with what is MBR is, it's basically 20 years old technology which is supposed to never exist like for the last 10 years, but they still support this, and operation system vendors still support this a little bit as a legacy, as a compatibility, and basically it doesn't have any security, so nothing to verify MBR, nothing to prevent MBR, so any attacker who got some privileges in the system could compromise MBR and make system unbootable. And ideally, it is not that hard to recover. But because there was no backup of the MBR originally, because there was no one thinking about that case, the system was not easily to recover. And there was some of the examples of ICS and SYS campaigns, which was targeting a device serial over Ethernet, which is basically part of between communication between ICS and SYS system and controller unit. And by targeting that device, you also could make a system break of some of the ICS or SYS system. And apparently there was no backup, there was no really easy way to verify that exactly this device was compromised. Then there was not easy way to recover. So you need to really precisely detect which of the component was targeted and really fast to replace it or recover that. So that was kind of giving us the idea that this type of threats is the real. So let's talk a little bit about architecture. We started a little bit explaining yesterday about the x86 architecture and why we're interested in the different components of this architecture and what we need to look for. What is the important part for the security perspective, on the platform security perspective. So in platform security perspective, is important is what the components in the system, how old they are, does it have any firmware, does this firmware is updatable. But also, we're really interested in two other really important things. One is persistency. So we're interested in the component which has non-volatile storage. So the component which has some memory, reprogrammable memory, neither for data or for the code, which you can neither read or write from the software perspective, to run integrity or to update the configuration. And you want to have it because a bunch of components has the functionality which you want to have configurable. You don't want to your system boot every time and you every time set everything for yourself in the setup screen. So you want to have the capability that the BIOS save that configuration somehow. So that's persistency is kind of one really important aspect for us as a security experts, because we want to understand what kind of persistent storage attacker can try to compromise. And second is protocols and buses. So all of these components is communicating for each other over the buses, and depends which bus it's communicating through. It may allow some extra capabilities to the attacker. So they may allow send a DMA transaction, or they may allow you bypass some of the spy cycles and like fake some of the values from the spy controller. So it depends on what buses that components is sitting. It may give attacker different advantage, different capabilities. So if the attacker will pick the proper component which has persistent storage and compromise that persistent storage by replacing the firmware or configuration, and then use that component over that buses to compromise the rest of the system, that's the scenario which attacker is looking for. So persistency and full control, plus sometimes stealthy capabilities. So, and as we a little bit get the idea of what we're looking for, we want to understand how does implants works and how does implant go into the system. So implants, like as simple as possible way, it need to find that persistent storage, which I was mentioning a second ago, and just to find a method to update the data on that storage. It could use physical presence, like physical access, and find a specific controller attached programmer physically and implant the system. So that's definitely a possible scenario for the servers, for the desktops, and for many controllers, like SPI controller, the hardware to reprogram it really cheap. So it doesn't cost much to do it. You only need to have a physical access to the system, neither during the supply chain or during the maintenance period or during some other ways to get the physical access to the system. Second way is from the software. So basically running neither the tools from the vendors, legitimate tools for the update the firmware and be in the middle of that process and inject the code there. Or from the operation system just to investigate some interfaces and find a way how to go it from the software side. Yesterday talk was actually about that. There is another way to implant the system. It's not always supposed to be modifying the code. It can also be just corrupting the data or modifying the data. So you may just disable some of the protections. So with physical access or with over software, you just, instead of changing the code, you change the data. And when you run the code integrity, you're fine, you need it implanted. But because the data was so sensitive, like S3 boot script, for example, or some other like really sensitive configuration, that will allow attacker to run the same privileges as persistency, but over the data. And even more, implanting could mean in some cases that attacker has to inject a device inside the hardware. So like, for example, it find a way how to inject in PCIe bus because of the sum of the PCIe port. He built a custom device, plugging it really carefully that it's not visible, and then connect it to Ethernet, for example. And then he has a persistent device running on the PCIe bus, which is allowing DMA capability, which is allowing fully own the entire host memory and extract all secrets. And in the same time, this device could be a network device, so it could send the data outbound, so invisible for the monitored software in a main host system. So that was about implanting. What do we know about bricks? Bricks a little bit different than implanting. We mostly don't care about, you don't care about like be stealthy, you just want to make system unbootable. And it's a little bit similar with implanting in the perspective of like, it's always cat and mouse game. So it's always like, do I know better method to infect the system than someone who will try to detect me? Or do I know the better way to break a system than someone will try to recover it? So in some cases like MBR1, or like legacy system like P6 system from 90s, we know like sometimes system didn't boot and we removed the battery for 30 seconds, we plugged the battery back and system boot for some magic. So you sort of figure out the way how to unbreak a system by some hardware faults. But that could be more complicated. It could be more technique which will allow the advanced attacker to break a system. And sometimes it's not that easy to figure out how to recover the system because you need to know exactly component and how to recover that component. Sometimes the component could be soldered in, so you need to unsolder that component from the motherboard. So this makes the process not that fast, so meaning that if it is part of the critical infrastructure, it could make some of financial damage to your organization. So as we're going forward, we will go through a couple components, a couple main components, which is definitely easy way to implant the system and break the system, and the first thing which attacker will take a look. So one is the SPI storage. The storage for the system firmware, the main storage for the basic configuration and basic code which is responsible to wake up the system when you powering on the button. Like when you booting the system and going from reset vector up to Dixie phase to booting the system. That's that code living in that SPI controller, SPI chip, which is controlled by SPI controller. Also there is another firmware which is living in that SPI storage, ME firmware, Intel Manageability Engine firmware, which is part of the chipset controller which is running in a PCH. So that firmware is also stored in that persistent storage. And there is also GBE, which is a Gigabit Ethernet controller configuration. So basically, if you have integrated network card, there's MAC address stored there, there's Ethernet configuration there. So by corrupting that, for example, you make this device doesn't work. So if you rely on integrated network card, and it will take you a couple of minutes or maybe a couple of hours to figure out that this network card doesn't work anymore and will not work because of the software reason. It has some hardware faults, and then you need to set the external network card to send traffic over. But you will have some time of that device will not work. And to recover it, you need to have a legitimate copy of GB region. If you don't have that copy, you couldn't recover easily. So part of your hardware wouldn't be bootable. So, and that spy storage has something which is called spy descriptor. It's like a first 4 kilobytes of that storage, which is responsible to define layout of that storage and a couple additional things. For example, it's responsible to set the permission table, which will tell which of the region would be accessible from which of the devices. It also has some of the configuration about that spy storage. So in case if you corrupt spy descriptor, then system at least will be not bootable. But if you try to exploit, you can try to play with the spy descriptor, if the spy descriptor is accessible, to try to enable different modes which may not be documented, or make a privilege escalation to the spy, to override the spy content itself. So that's like a really quick example of how you can decode spy descriptor with some of the open source tools. There's a couple of them. There's FlashROM, there's ShipSec, there's a couple more tools which is giving you a good visibility on the spy descriptor. But then you will also want to understand, does the attacker has access to it or not? And then you need to take a look on the permission table, which is part of that spy descriptor. And then you can see, like right here, like spy descriptor is read-only. So basically meaning that CPU is host, basically. So CPU has only read-only permission for the spy descriptor, meaning that in this specific case, software couldn't modify the spy descriptor from the ring 0. It may be another ways to do it, but not from the software part. But then, if you will find something like this, read right here, then that's just like a vulnerability. Because this meaning that ring 0 could modify spy descriptor, and spy descriptor contained this table. So if software could modify this table, if it could modify spy descriptor, it could modify entire table and mess the permissions here. So at least you will break the system, but you can also make some nice exploit from here as well. So that's like one of the basic mechanism. How does hardware supposed to be configured properly to prevent the implant in the system, to prevent the break in the system. But there is also another, one of the most important thing which is supposed to be configured in modern x86 system to prevent modification of that persistent spy storage. It's something which is called bias control register. And this bias control register is the mechanism implemented in the PCH specifically designed to prevent the write cycle to the spy storage. It does work interestingly because this register was designed in a way that you could deliver the legitimate updates to the BIOS. So you cannot only set like read-only forever. You cannot do it because in this case you will not update your BIOS. So you want to have the capabilities to deliver some of the update over some legitimate interface. Then you need to play a little bit in who you will trust. So, and in this case, there is like something like, call it SMM, System Management Mode. System Management Mode has the capabilities to override the spy content. And this register is configured in a way that if you're not in SMM, you don't have permissions to override the spy content. If you're in SMM, then you have the permissions to override the spy content. So configuring this register is highly important for each system. If this register is not configured correctly, then the system could be implanted or bricked really easily. And we saw like yesterday that APT29 was presented by ESET in the Blue Hat that demonstrate that the modern UEFI rootkits using exploits, which is exploiting weaknesses in the configuration of this register. So basically, the exploit checks if this is not properly configured, then it writes a special like sequence or send like some of the cycles during race condition to override the spy content. That was pretty interesting and pretty impressive because it was in the wild, exploiting the vulnerability to implant the system. Yeah, so really interesting case study. Anyway, moving forward. So, okay, you figure out the ways how to protect the system. You figure out the ways what you need to take a look when you're infecting the system and the attacker infecting the system. Now you need to understand how exactly you would infect, what exactly you wouldn't replace. So the easy target is you will try to find a UEFI application or Dixie driver, the part of the boot flow, and you will replace that part of the boot flow. So by doing that, you need to understand the format of the content of the SPI descriptor. And there is a bunch of good technology and tools which is doing that. There's pretty complicated flow. You have UEFI volumes, you have compression sections, and then inside the compression sections you have the PE files. So there's like entire hierarchy. Think about this as a file system. So, and then you will find the file in the file system, but in that special file system. And then you will replace that file. You just need to make sure that whenever you will replace it or will edit a new one, that will be also the part of the boot sequence and the moment when you need it. Because if it will be too early, you may not have that capabilities which you're looking for. If it will be too late, the system may be already locked down, so you will not have that capabilities which you're looking for. So anyway, you need to find the right time and the right place to infect your executable code. And then you need to fix some of the checksums. You need to make sure that you have the proper size. Size is not going over your firmware volume and stuff like that. It's more engineering work, and in this APT28, there was a demonstration that it could be done all automatically. So any server, any laptop which exists right now, if there is not properly set that protection which was mentioned previously, system could be infected, making fully persistent, fully own. Attacker could own the system for like multiple years, be really stealth, exfiltrate data from the servers over the time. And there is another really interesting tools. There's same tools, but another capability in the tools, replacing the executables, which makes it even easily in attacker perspective, on the POC perspective. So if you want to play around, you just run chipsec, find the vulnerable platform, and then you can use the tools to install a PLC implant from the GitHub. So we talk a little bit about how the defense is supposed to work in perspective of the configuration. But there is also a bunch of implementation around. And I mentioned that SMM should deliver the BIOS update. But it's not really like that. There is a special method, capsule update, which is responsible to deliver the updates to the system. And the capsule update, it's supposed to run during the boot time or on when you're waking up from the sleep state. For some of the other security reasons. So if you will see any of the tool is doing runtime update for the BIOS, they probably do it wrong. Because at runtime, there is a bunch of devices running in parallel, which has a DMA capability, which may give an attacker a huge room to run the attack against the BIOS update mechanism. And this could be used for the attacker also to update the SPI content if the capsule update was designed not properly. And that was one of the cases which I will go in a second. But before that, a little bit about Supermicro, the part of our study for this specific presentation. Supermicro has the UEFI BIOS update. It's basically done over the DOS or Linux utilities, like a DOS. Or over BMC interface, you can also run the BIOS update. To update the BMC, you can use also the UI from the BMC or the local LAN interface, which makes it like more or less good functionality for the admin to deliver update. But what we saw in the security perspective, that the BIOS update was not signed. So it was not signed neither like a capsule update, but it was not signed at all. So basically, you can just put your own module, use legitimate tools, update the BIOS, and infect the system. Moreover, it updates an entire SPI, so you can update everything, including SPI descriptor. And it doesn't have rollback protection, so in case if that will be some updates which will fix some vulnerabilities, and you like that vulnerabilities, you want that vulnerabilities back. So like attacker want that vulnerabilities for some other reason, they can just use the legitimate update to update with old version of the BIOS. So that was pretty interesting study, and that was the common for entire vendor. So all of the hardware is this vendor release. They use the same mechanism. They release in about a quarter of million server, like about 1 million server per year, and all of that could be infected by only by running only open source tool to repackage the image and the legitimate tool which they provided to update, to infect the system. There is a quick demo about that, how to infect. Okay, so yeah, that's really quick demo. So Supermicro system, boot into the DOS, and then we run in from here utilities from Supermicro, and it basically, the image was preparing a little bit before, so we infected this image. It could be done all from the OS level. You just need to figure out which of the SMI it will trigger, and then you just simulate this tool. We was just, for the demo purpose, we're just not doing that. We just took the original tool and ran it from the original tool to infect this, the system from in a Supermicro server. Also, we use completely open source the implant, so it was like nothing which you need to do. We just take it from the GitHub, build it, infect the image, and you're done. So with a little bit more work, attackers, of course, can do much more advanced stuff. Like that was like the idea of how simple it could be. It could be as complicated as attacker want in perspective of post-exploitation. So if you see here, it will erasing all of the chip, it's writing all of the chip, including NVRAM, including boot block, including BIOS block. It runs some checks, rebooting the system. And during the boot flow, before the operation system starts, we see that system is implanted. So from this point of view, attacker can control everything in the system, make system unbootable, or fully compromise the operation system, and hook all of the API they want. So let me come back to the slides. There is other methods to break the system. One of that is SPD. SPD EEPROM is basically a persistent memory inside the DIMM controller in the system memory. It could be in some cases accessible for the read. And if you will decode and read and will understand what is inside that storage, there is a voltage information, there is a frequency information. By corrupting the system, you make your system memory not work, and that will be hard to figure out why the system doesn't work. And the funny part of it that there's a specification which is telling you how to log that SPD, but it's not always the case that BIOS is doing that. So there's a bunch of work needs to be done correctly in the BIOS to set that log bit. So UEFI variables, we already mentioned this multiple years ago, like in 2015, 16, 17. Anyway, it's still a problem. You still have the capabilities to break a system if you delete the variable, or if you override the variable, or if you duplicate the variable. UEFI variables is basically the configuration of the system firmware. So that's the example of one of the really popular variable, setup variable, which is, if you will corrupt that variable in many systems, they will not work. The system will not boot it. So another really interesting and not that popular is flash over route. Basically, the flash chip is making could capable to make only a certain amount of writes during the lifetime. And if your chip is accessible for writes, you can write like 200,000 times over 8 hours and make the system, break a system in a way that someone need to desolder the chip and solder the new one to recover the system. And that's like small controller which could make a bunch of damage for the server. Option ROM, this is a persistent storage in the devices. You can, if option ROM base exists for some of the devices, like a big network card or something like that, you can use API which is vendor provide to you to read that option ROM, but sometimes even to write to the option ROMs. And if you write to the option ROMs, you can also break the device, but it's not only break the device. Option ROM is the part of the main boot flow. So you can put like infinite loop, and then that infinite loop will not let the system boots if the device will be set in hardware. So with this, I will go and switch to the Jesse to explain the second part of the presentation about BMC. Yeah, we will fix it in a second. Do you want to use mine? Because this does work. I can give you the one.
Well, can we just swap?
Yeah, we can just try to swap this. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
¿Lo había sacado?
Debí estar sacando, te lo cambio por el
So
1.
this does work. You
Te lo
just
cambio
can
por el 1.
replace it.
Dámelo.
Okay, there we go. Okay, thanks, Alex. So with another another component in the system that we've talked about today, and Nico and Matthias talked about the BMC also, is just there's this out-of-band management component within servers. And if you don't know anything about this yet, it's used for sensor monitoring, KVM. It's basically a management platform within the system that runs on its own. You can use it to reflash the BIOS. That's one of the key functions, is being able to flash the BIOS, make sure that you can boot up the system. You don't want to go to the data center and have to plug in a monitor and fix the system that way. So here's an example of one of the interfaces. There's a remote control, there's KVM. You can power it on, power it off. There's serial over LAN functionality. You can also basically emulate a floppy or CD-ROM from an image shared across the network, and that shows up. It shows up on the target system, acting like a real physical device. And your operating system, you can boot off of it. It's a pretty useful functionality. You can flash the BIOS from BAC. That's a pretty key feature. This particular one, you need to pay to enable that feature. There have been a number of vulnerabilities discovered in BMCs in the past. This was one found just last year in HP ILO, where they had a pretty fun, it was a complete authentication bypass by having a connection header that had 29 A's. It basically overflowed a particular flag on the stack that determined if it was a local request or a remote request. And if it's a local request, it does not require any authentication, and it will just do whatever you want. So you could say, give this particular HTTP header and say, create a user with, create a new admin user for me with this password, and it'll just go do it for you. So that one was pretty cool. Here's an example of some of the information that you can get from IPMI over just there's a get device ID field, which is a mandatory IPMI command. And it'll tell you things like manufacturer ID, product ID, device ID, and the firmware version that's in that particular device. And for this particular example, you can tell if it's vulnerable by checking the device ID, manufacturer ID, and if it's below a certain firmware level, then it's vulnerable to this. We also heard about the Dell iDRAC issues that Nico and Matthias talked about yesterday. Those were pretty cool also. Unauthorized remote code execution in the BMC is pretty scary. One of the other older vulnerabilities is the Supermicro X9 back in 2003 or 2013. Dan Farmer and H.D. Moore worked together and published some interesting results. Basically, they found a lot of bugs in BMC, including like static encryption keys, hard-coded credentials. When they were auditing the web applications for BMC, they found so many places of unsafe string handling that they just stopped even trying to add CVEs and just gave this whole list to Supermicro and had them go fix them. So we're going to take a closer look at some of the different Supermicro BMCs and some of the different generations. X8 and X9 used an older type of, a couple different types of chips with firmware from AMI A10. When they transitioned to X10 and X11, they moved over to A-Speed instead with a different, basically the BMC firmware came from a different vendor. And things changed a little bit, but we'll take a look at what specifically changed. So figuring out what's in a BMC image in the first place, we'll just run binwalk in it, and we'll see some interesting things pop up, like there's a cramfs file system, there's a zip file, which the name is kernel.bin, which is kind of fun, and then there's another cramfs file system. And we found some copyright strings, but if we take a closer look and actually unpack the cramfs archives, we can find the code that actually handles those updates. And in this particular example, it basically scans through the update image to look for regions using this magic value. And if we then go look in the update file itself, we find that magic value, and there's essentially metadata at the end of each region that has information like there's a key piece of information called the burn address, which is the address within the SPI that this particular region of the update is going to be burned to. We do have the name of the region, and then there's a checksum. The checksum doesn't cover the region. It only covers the metadata for this particular region. So it detects if this is valid metadata. So that burn address, like the base of the image, is 4 with 7 zeros after it. And you basically subtract the base address from the burn address start offset. If you remember the cramfs from a few slides, that first one was at 1, 8, and 4 zeros, which matches up with one of our regions here. So our first file system is at offset 1, 8 zeros, and at the end of this region is at 9, 2, 0, 0. So we know how we can carve out that specific region and take a look at it. If we kind of take a little bit of a further look, we determined that the last region in this particular firmware image is special. The update code does look for this A10S firmware signature. There's a couple bytes that are checked for, but it doesn't have I think there's a 71 byte and the 03 byte are the only ones that it's really looking for, other than this A10 signature at the end. But if we put it all together, we basically have our layout kind of looks like this, where there's a bootloader for the first 64K of the image. It's this WPCM 450 bootloader from Winbond. We've got some padding. We've got a cramfs for the root file system, a zip kernel, a cramfs for the web file system. And we've got some metadata at the end of each of those regions. Let's see. This was the update image, and there's like a padding region. On a live file system, that's actually replaced with a JFFS2 file system that's used for non-volatile storage of configuration information, event log, anything that it wants to persist in the BMC across reboots. The X8 generation uses the exact same format as this for their firmware updates. So for X10, they did change the processor entirely, going with ASpeed instead. Also, they changed the bootloader, so they're using U-boot, and they're no longer using that end of region metadata. But they have something even nicer. They basically have these image tags that specify exactly like the start address, the start offset, end offset. This time they actually have a CRC for the region itself. So that CRC 32, you need to recalculate that when you change the region. But then they also have the name of the region when they built this image from their file. So the region is really similar. The only difference is the bootloader region is bigger, and it's not a zipped kernel anymore. It's just like a standard Linux image that would be loaded by U-boot. And then there is the image tags at a particular address after those two file systems and kernel. So they did something really interesting for the X11 generation. So the part was basically within the same family, just a small change, but the firmware format, we can't tell what's in it by using our previous methods. Even if you run binwalk, it doesn't detect anything except a ton of individual compressed streams. And if you try to extract it with binwalk, you'll end up with a multi-gigabyte mess that is not useful at all. But after some further investigation, one thing that we figured out was that they basically had used exactly the same format as the X10, but they used hard-coded AES keys and initialization vectors to encrypt that image tag and the very first section of each of the CRAMFS regions. So they didn't encrypt the entire image, just the header of those CRAMFS regions, and it's only in the update image. If you actually flash this to a real system, do an update to this, it unencrypts it, writes it to the SPI in a real system, and then it's completely unencrypted. And it's super easy to extract the encryption keys using a physical flash programmer, but also because the encryption only covers the CRAMFS headers, it's pretty trivial to reconstruct the CRAMFS header and extract the file system and find the encryption key that way. Here's a code snippet that we found in the code that's handling that particular part of the update. Basically, it goes and checks each of these two addresses to see if it's already been decrypted, and if it isn't, it goes and decrypts it. So the region layout is completely identical to X10, except they have these slightly encrypted blobs. And it's funny that I presume that they tried to do this to make it harder to attack the system, but it's just obfuscation at this point. It's completely hard-coded encryption key. It's not a real significant barrier to any attacker. So we now know how to extract and repack X8 through X11 generation BMC images, which is from 2009 to the current generation. But how does the update mechanism work itself? So in order to update the BMC, you basically send it IPMI commands, and those can either happen over the local system interface or over the IPMI LAN interface. And there's something pretty interesting about that, because the local system interface between the host and the BMC is completely unauthenticated. So if you're running code in the system, maybe malware is running on your server, it can send whatever commands it wants to the BMC, and it can do some pretty interesting things. So we discovered also that, like the UEFI firmware updates, they're not doing any signed signature validation of the BMC, even though the BMC is a highly privileged management component. So we've got a hopefully quick example of basically flashing this with a malicious BMC image. And so we basically have netcat listening. We've created a malicious image that basically has a ARM version of a reverse connect back shell in it. And we'll run the legitimate update tool from Supermicro to flash one of these modified images to the system. It does have the functionality to do this remotely over the network. And one thing that's pretty interesting about the IPMI spec is that there's support for IPMI group managed systems, where you can have a large number of servers that all use the same credentials. And that can be really useful for an attacker, because if you own one system, you could potentially steal that password and use it to own all the other servers in that IPMI managed group. And this process over the IPMI link is pretty slow, because it basically sends an individual IPMI message for every, I think, 52 bytes of the image. And this is a 32 meg firmware image. So it takes a while. So we'll skip ahead a little ways. I think the full process is about 15 minutes. And it's basically just passing, it's like sending IPMI messages to send each of these different regions across the local system interface to the BMC, where the BMC is receiving it and let's see. So at this point, we've transferred the complete image to the BMC. The BMC is validating it, parsing it, seeing if it looks okay. And then after that, it goes ahead and writes it to the flash. So this is kind of a slow process also, but we can skip ahead a little ways. So once it's done, it's rebooting. So just the BMC reboots, the server stays up and running. If you have some application running on the system and somebody runs this while you're not looking, there's no indication, there's no interruption of the server, and it keeps running. Only the BMC reboots. So we got our connect back from the BMC, and we can start taking a look around in the system. This is basically just a reverse shell. So it's an ARM processor. We can take a look at the CPU info field, or a CPU info file. It is the A-speed BMC. So we do have successfully basically put whatever we want in the BMC. We can have this connect back to a command and control and run whatever we want. So all servers from 2009 to X10, the current generation, are vulnerable to this. Like Alex said, they still have approximately 1 million servers every year. Millions of servers are vulnerable in the field. So if we take another look at our architecture diagram before, so now we know how we know a number of ways that we can brick the UEFI BIOS boot via software, but usually the BMC is used to recover from this state. But now we also know how to brick the BMC via software. So just in this environment, we can create a situation where the server won't boot up again unless you have basically you need to go take physical access and attach a flash programmer to every BMC in order to recover the system. And that could be hundreds of thousands of systems in a large data center. And that's going to take some time and some money. But there's also another interesting thing that you get if you own the BMC like this, is that maybe you have a couple different servers. One is connected to the internet. One is only connected to a private cloud. There isn't a direct connection from the internet into your cloud. There isn't a direct connection between these two servers. So even if the server is owned, because this local IPMI system interface is unauthenticated, you can pretty directly connect to the BMC, run whatever you want in the BMC. And the BMC is often shared between, that management interface is often shared between different servers. So you can use that to basically laterally move within the environment, especially if you're using IPMI group managed systems. So we have got some ways to detect some of these. ChipSec is, like I mentioned, it's a really great tool for exploring your system, and we do have this whitelist capability, so you can basically generate a whitelist, run that against the server periodically, see if anything has changed. The SPI descriptor, there's also a module in ChipSec that will go and read your SPI descriptor. It'll look for access permissions. It'll warn you if it's writable. In this particular example, when we did this research, there was almost 1,000 vulnerable models that we identified. Vendors have started fixing the SPI descriptors, but it's going to take a while for all of those to be fixed. So for checking the integrity of the BMC, Supermicro's update tool actually does have the functionality to dump the existing firmware. So you can use that, take a look at it, and see if it's the version that you expect, see if there's something that you don't expect there. So we reported these UEFI and BIOS issues back in January to Supermicro, and reported the BMC issues in March. And we've got a little bit of additional information about the timeline and what we did at these two links you guys can check out later. So Supermicro basically, they only fixed this for the X9 and X10 generation, and they're making it optional to update these systems for existing systems. So you basically need to go ask them to get the update for these systems, which is maybe not the best for security. But one thing that really was interesting about this, like at least the last day or two, was that like the APT28 rootkit did confirm that these UEFI implants do really exist in the wild. We've already seen examples of bricking systems used in like for real attack campaigns, but server firmware continues to be just a big problem, and there have been so many fixes, mitigations, and basic hardening of operating system and applications that firmware security is lagging way behind, and you can still have some pretty serious damage that comes out of bricking or implanting systems like this. And that's it.